Take a look at Belarus from space. You will see that this country wasn't particularly lucky with its place on the map. For example, it has no access to the sea, unlike its neighbors Lithuania or Poland. And access to the sea is always a bonus, providing free food in the form of fishing and also access to global trade. After all, maritime shipping accounts for more than 80% of global trade, but lacking a coast is not a death sentence. For example, Switzerland and Austria have somehow managed to become wealthy without one. However, Belarus wasn't just unlucky with its access to the sea. About 7% of the country's territory consists of swamps. Don't get me wrong, swamps are great when your country is being invaded because it's advantageous for guerrilla fighters to hide in them. But for agriculture, which could feed the population, they are less than useless. The remaining territory of Belarus is mostly covered by forests, so you can't just plow the land. And the soil in Belarus is less fertile than in neighboring Ukraine due to its colder climate. Yes, today, thanks to modern technology, Belarus produces stable harvests, and people don't go hungry. However, careful consideration is needed when choosing what to cultivate. For example, the world's most popular crop, wheat, is simply unprofitable to grow in Belarus. That's why, among European countries, Belarus ranks fourth from the bottom in terms of grain yield, standing close to northern Iceland. This is precisely why the less climate-sensitive potato is so significant for Belarus. Because of its geography, there even was a Soviet-era joke. Belarus is divided into 3 equal parts: 1/3 forests, 1/3 swamps, and 1/3 potatoes. Belarusians lived relatively well during Soviet times. You can even see this in photos of Soviet-era Minsk with its clean green streets. And if you think we're only showing staged Soviet propaganda shots, here are some photographs from French photographer Jacques Dupouquier. Even when the Soviet Union was falling apart in the late 1980s, economic growth continued in the Belarusian SSR. This naturally raises the question, how was this possible if the republic essentially had nothing of its own? Belarus was jokingly called the assembly shop of the Soviet Union because this republic produced large volumes of complex machinery. Soviet citizens were well acquainted with the Belarus tractor, as well as Minsk refrigerators and motorcycles. These products were either distributed across the USSR or exported. However, if we look at the structure of Belarusian exports in the late Soviet era, we'll find not only machinery but also oil and oil products. Oil? From where? Belarus doesn't have any significant oil reserves. So where in the world did they get it from? Well, its neighbor, Russia, certainly has a lot of it. The Druzhba oil pipeline runs through Belarus from Russia, supplying Eastern Europe with oil since Soviet times, while another pipeline from Surgut sends oil to the Baltic states. And it's not just oil. Gas pipelines also run through Belarus, including the Torzhok-Minsk-Ivatsevichi pipeline and the Yamal-Europe pipeline. The first was built in the USSR to supply Soviet Republic with gas, while Yamal-Europe was a product of the 90s, designed to sell gas to Europe. The Yamal-Europe pipeline runs through Belarus for the simplest reasons. It's the shortest land route to Germany, until recently the main consumer of Russian gas, and it's also convenient in terms of the number of countries the pipeline has to cross. This is beneficial for 2 reasons. First, it's cheaper, as fewer countries need to be paid for transit. Second, it reduces political risks associated with neighboring countries blocking the pipeline. Today, 1/5 of all foreign goods purchased by Belarus consists of oil and gas supplies from Russia. This transit-based structure of the Belarusian economy makes the country vulnerable. If the flow of resources through Belarus stops, so does its economic growth. Under these conditions, the most important thing for the country is maintaining stable and strong relationships with its neighbors on both sides to ensure the flow of resources never stops. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Belarus, it had to rebuild these relationships from scratch, including with Russia, which hasn't always been the best friend to Belarus, contrary to what you might think. But before we get to that, I want to tell you about one intense political race that made an ordinary guy from a farm collective the president of the country, a man you all know well. Imagine that for 70 years you had a factory consisting of 15 workshops. Some were engaged in resource extractions, others in processing, and some in assembling the final product. But then, each workshop became a separate enterprise with its own director, appointing department, accounting department, and sales division. Now, instead of the well-coordinated work of the entire factory, each workshop has to negotiate with the others and solve its own problems. The collapse of the USSR into 15 independent states in 1991 turned out to be exactly this division of the factory into 15 separate companies. And in this analogy, Belarus was the workshop specializing in assembly of the final product. If it did not receive semi-finished products from other workshops, it simply could not function. The main problem was that complex industries like those in Belarus were especially vulnerable to supply chain disruptions because they had too many independent links. Let me explain this using the example of the Minsk fridge production. To assemble a fridge, you need a body, insulation, shelves, a door, and a motor compressor that circulates refrigerant through the pipes. However, the Minsk factory did not manufacture these components itself. They mostly arrived already produced. After the collapse of the USSR, problems with the supply of components began, and the factory started losing out to foreign competitors. The thing is, many goods produced within the USSR had a market cleared of competitors, leaving consumers with no choice. Previously, Belarus literally exchanged its high-tech goods for food, but now the scheme had broken down. In a free market, Belarusian goods simply lost demand. They couldn't compete, and Belarus had no alternative sources of income. This happened at a time when the country desperately needed a foreign currency influx to prevent famine. The threat was real because by 1994, 1/5 of Belarus's population was living below the poverty line. Therefore, as early as 1990s, the BSSR began transitioning to a market economy. Privatization was launched, private business was allowed, and price controls were lifted. In essence, they started doing the same things done in Russia. However, unlike Russia, where the decree of price liberalization from January 1st, 1992 applied to all goods and hit the economy like a truck, Belarus initially introduced free pricing only for luxury items such as fur coats and gold jewelry. And here's why. It is widely known that in the 1980s, the USSR experienced a goods shortage because the state bank was not independent from government decisions, unlike today's Bank of Russia, and it printed money whenever the government needed. As a result, the amount of money in the country grew faster than the volume of production of goods and services. By 1990, there were over 6 rubles in circulation for every ruble's worth of goods available. This is how inflation works when the gap between money supply and goods must be balanced by rising prices. But since prices in the USSR were set by the state rather than the market, they couldn't rise. Instead, inflation manifested itself covertly as a goods shortage, because at those official prices, no one wanted to sell anything. The goal of Belarusian price liberalization was to slightly reduce this problem. Although only a few people could afford luxury goods like fur coats, even this small maneuver helped to partially reduce the money supply in circulation. This way, when prices were eventually freed for all goods, the shock would be less severe. Privatization in Belarus was carried out through the issuance of personal privatization checks called property. However, out of 8 million citizens, only 5 million received them, and by 2019, about 40% of these checks had still not been redeemed. The reason was that just like in Russia, people simply didn't understand the purpose of privatization checks or vouchers. But while savvy individuals in Russia could buy up vouchers from the public, in Belarus, the checks were personalized and couldn't be sold to third parties. Some of these checks could be exchanged for a discount when purchasing housing, but this benefit was only available to those in the most need. As a result, privatization failed both in Russia and in Belarus. Either country's population became co-owners of enterprises. However, in Russia, many enterprises ended up in private hands, including those of foreign investors, whereas in Belarus, almost no one showed up to claim their property slated for privatization, so it remained state-owned. This is understandable. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1990s, about 20% of people in Belarus were living below the poverty line. The last thing they cared about was dealing with complex financial instruments. They had to feed their families by any means necessary, including criminal activities. Organized crime in Belarus emerged and developed much like in Russia during the 1990s, but it had one distinguishing feature. Belarus's main characteristic is its geographical location and its status as a transit country. That's why in the early 90s, Belarus became a center for smuggling. Everything imaginable was being transported through the country, including radioactive materials. In the spring of 1992, about 5 kilograms of uranium was seized at the country's border in Brest. It was supposed to be sold in Poland to unknown buyers for $50,000. By 1995, smugglers had attempted to transport nearly 100 kilograms of uranium through Belarus into Europe. This uranium had been stolen from a Russian plant in Udmurtia that produced fuel for nuclear reactors and had traveled 2,000 kilometers before being discovered at the border. Those involved in the operation later recounted that the uranium containers had been wrapped in ordinary socks. Illegal business flourished in the 90s, particularly around automobiles. However, while in Russia this involved car thefts, robberies, and other internal crimes, Belarusians engaged in cross-border operations. To a large extent, it was thanks to Belarusian criminals that in the 90s, the share of illegally imported foreign cars in Russia was around 20%. One of the common car smuggling schemes from Belarus to Russia looked like this. One of the European criminal partners of Belarusian organized crime groups would buy an expensive car in Europe. Then they would drive it to Minsk, where the car, along with its documents, would be sold under the table to local gangsters at half price. The gangsters would change the car's identification numbers and sell it in Russia as a used foreign car, while the European partners would report the car stolen in their country and collect insurance payouts. As a result, the criminals would recover the cost of purchasing the car through the insurance claim, while the sale of the car in Russia minus fuel costs provided a clear profit from the operation. From this, it is clear that ordinary people in Belarus in the 90s were not concerned about vouchers, but rather about poverty and rampant crime. This dramatic shift in public sentiment gave some politicians the opportunity to transform from market liberals into advocates of state regulation and crime fighters. One politician who managed to take advantage of this window of opportunity was a deputy from the Shklov district of the Mogilev region, Alexander Grigorievich Lukashenko. His political career started in a rather straightforward manner. He was a Komsomol member, and after serving in the border troops, he returned to his homeland, studied at the Belarusian Agricultural Academy, and later became the chairman of a collective farm in the region where he had grown up. As a deputy of the Supreme Council, Lukashenko became a media favorite because he positioned himself as a true people's representative and eagerly gave interviews. By criticizing his political opponents, he built a reputation among voters as an honest and principled politician. Lukashenko himself said that he was neither with the left nor the right, but with the people.
Ни с левыми, ни с правыми, с народом.
Therefore, when a government commission to combat corruption was created in 1993, Lukashenko was the perfect candidate for its chair. In December 1993, he presented a report in parliament accusing specific individuals in the country's leadership of ties with corrupt officials. However, no concrete charges were actually put forward in this report, and the speech was more of a populist appeal aimed at gaining voter attention.
Чтобы каждый знал наперед, что если только он посмеет поднять не то что кулак, а только палец, он будет немедленно отрублен. И не надо здесь замазывать эти проблемы. Каждый за свое должен ответить.
Despite the lack of substantive accusations, following this report, a vote was held on the dismissal of two key government officials, one of whom was Lukashenko's longtime opponent, Vyacheslav Kebich. The attempt to remove him failed, but within 2 days, the report was published in a newspaper, turning Lukashenko into a well-known and widely adored corruption fighter across the country. After the report, as head of the government, Vyacheslav Kebich shut down the commission, but by then it was too late. Lukashenko's plan had already worked, and here's why. 12 days before Lukashenko's report, the final draft of the Belarusian constitution was approved by the Supreme Council. The adoption had been delayed for a long time due to debates on whether Belarus needed a president and at which age someone should run for the office. On the first issue, the parliament had 3 opinions to choose from: the president as head of state and head of the executive branch, like in the US; the president as head of state but not head of the executive branch, like in Russia; or Belarus as a parliamentary republic without a president. The debate over the minimum age to become president had 2 proposals: 35 or 40 years. So, 12 days before the report, the vote in the Supreme Council resulted in the strongest presidential model being chosen, with the eligibility age set at 35 instead of 40. It seems that at this very moment, 39-year-old Lukashenko realized that he had to strike while the iron was hot and fight for the position of the first president of independent Belarus. In the first presidential elections in the summer of 1994, 3 candidates had a serious chance of winning: Alexander Lukashenko, Vyacheslav Kebich, and Zenon Pozniak. Here they are, all 3 depicted in a caricature from that election period. From left to right: Chairman of the Council of Ministers of Belarus, Vyacheslav Kebich; Director of the Gorodets State Farm, Alexander Lukashenko; and leader of the Belarusian Popular Front Party, Zenon Pozniak. What can be said about Lukashenko's competitors? Kebich, despite his high position as chairman of the Council of Ministers, had a controversial reputation in the eyes of the public due to Lukashenko's corruption report. Lukashenko had partially neutralized him even before the election campaign. As for Zenon Pozniak, his Belarusian Popular Front Party had a key policy in its election platform. He and his supporters consistently opposed granting the Russian language the status of a second official language in Belarus. Even during the campaign, Pozniak demonstratively answered all questions in Belarusian. It's hard to say how much impact it had on his resulting defeat, but as the 1996 referendum later showed, over 80% of the population supported making Russian an official language, and when more than 80% of the population opposes one of the main points of your election platform, it's difficult to win. As a result, in the first round, Lukashenko received 45% of the votes, Vyacheslav Kebich 17.3%, and Zenon Pozniak almost 13%. Thus, Kebich and Lukashenko proceeded to the second round. On one side stood the people's candidate and a champion of justice, and on the other, a representative of the old elites who had far less public support. Thus, in the second round, Lukashenko won with 80% of the votes, and on July 10, 1994, at the age of 39, he became the first and, so far, the only president of the Republic of Belarus. The phenomenon of his presidency was a product of the difficult circumstances Belarusians faced after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Political instability, a public demand for justice, and a desire to improve living standards allowed an ordinary collective farm chairman who happened to be in the right place at the right time to rise to the top of power. It was this ordinary man of the people who would later roll back many market reforms and begin construction of an authoritarian regime in the heart of Europe. Lukashenko would take relations with Russia to a new level, ensuring that the main beneficiary of these ties would be his corporation called Belarus. After the elections, the first president of Belarus began restoring order in the country, as he had promised during his campaign. His program focused on three main objectives: stabilizing the economy by rejecting market reforms, combating crime, and maintaining good relations with neighboring countries. Lukashenko started with domestic policy. He began personally approving all major privatization deals to ensure that no significant enterprise bypassed his oversight. Later, deals that had already been completed but were found to have violations were annulled, and these enterprises were returned to state ownership. The second priority for the new president was the fight against organized crime. It is widely believed that extrajudicial methods played a significant role in addressing this issue. There is no direct evidence of this, but here is what Lukashenko himself said about it in 2013. They come to me and tell me a car was stopped, someone was killed, and the vehicle was stolen. Bandits see a Mercedes or an Audi driving by. They stop it, pretending to be the police or whatever else. They take away the car and everything inside it. I was forced to take radical measures. We gathered several groups. There weren't many such cars. Took high-end vehicles and set traps along the highway from the Russian border to Brest. Every bandit who resisted was shot on the spot. 3 such groups were eliminated. There was no fourth, and since then it has been quiet and peaceful. Lukashenko recounted this story at a press conference in 2013. We did not make it up. The transcript is available on the official website of the President of the Republic of Belarus. This radical crackdown on crime yielded results. Within 2 years of Lukashenko's presidency, by 1996, the country achieved its first economic growth of 2.6% GDP. As for the third point, establishing friendly relations with Belarus's main neighbor, things were not so smooth. Initially, this wasn't even a priority for the Belarusian government, but as a result of the partial reversal of privatization, foreign investors' interests were affected. Thus, Belarus strained its relations with most of the Western world and predictably began struggling to acquire new loans. Without these loans, purchasing food and maintaining economic growth became significantly more challenging. This led to the creation of the customs union between Russia and Belarus, which allowed the two countries to trade without tariffs. Why did Belarus need this? Because the duty-free access to the Russian market enabled its assembly workshop to supply cheaper goods compared to other exporters, allowing Belarusian enterprises to gain a competitive edge. As a result, they started receiving more orders once again. For example, if in 1995 the export of engineering products from Belarus amounted to $1.5 billion, by 1997 it had grown to $2.3 billion. And of course, this growth was largely driven by the increase in exports to Russia. Additionally, Belarus began receiving Russian gas at preferential prices. At one point, it even reached a state where Russian oil cost less for Belarus than it did for Russian companies. Whether this happened due to the friendship between Yeltsin and Lukashenko or for other reasons is not precisely known, but the fact remains. As a result of such diplomatic efforts, by the late 1990s, about a third of all foreign currency revenues in the Belarusian budget came from trade of oil and oil product. If you didn't catch that, this was a country with almost no oil reserves, some of which were even contaminated by the Chernobyl disaster. For context, in the Russian state budget for 2025, the share of oil and gas revenues will be 27%. This is in Russia, one of the world's leading raw material exporters. Meanwhile, in the 1990s, Belarus, with practically no oil, received a third of its income from oil trade. But it cannot be said that Belarus gave nothing in return. It readily transferred the remaining Soviet nuclear arsenal to Russia, held a referendum granting the Russian language official status, and allowed duty-free imports of Russian goods. However, Belarus would not have been able to maintain the nuclear arsenal on its own anyway. 80% of its population already spoke Russian fluently, and Russia was mainly exporting oil and gas to Belarus, which was desperately needed by the country. By 1997, GDP per capita growth exceeded 10% and remained stable at around 6% in the following years, which was at least as good as the situation in Russia. Thus, by the beginning of the new millennium, Belarus had managed to transition from survival concerns to building a cozy and successful country in the heart of Europe. But it wasn't that simple. Suddenly, a problem arose. Russia had a new president.
В соответствии с Конституцией, уходя в отставку, я подписал указ о возложении обязанностей президента России на председателя правительства Владимира Владимировича Путина.
With Boris Yeltsin's departure in 1999, Belarus's period of extremely favorable relations with its neighbor ended. The accommodating Yeltsin was replaced by a young Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who had his own views on politics. While Yeltsin maintained a friendship with Lukashenko to support his own ratings, the new Russian president had no such need. Vladimir Putin's approval rating in 2000 was 76%. Moreover, Vladimir Putin's political career had developed in the new Russia, and he did not feel bound by old commitments to former republics. Because of this, friendship with Lukashenko in itself ceased to be valuable to the new president, and Putin began demanding not just brotherly embraces from Belarus, but concrete actions. Thus, in 2002, Russia proposed creating a unified state with universal suffrage, where the Russian ruble would serve as the common currency. Accepting such a constitution would essentially mean Belarus joining Russia as 6 new regions. Alexander Lukashenko saw little benefit in such unification and declared that the proposals for a Russia-Belarus union state were deliberately unacceptable and offensive, adding that even under Stalin, no one had come up with such an idea.
Как-то Чубайс и Гайдар предлагал расчленить Беларусь на 6 частей и включить ее в состав России. Так же не будет, так в сталинские времена не было.
As a result, the idea of a union state between Russia and Belarus still occasionally appears in the media, but it has never gone anywhere. However, the customs union remained, and trade with neighbors continued to drive Belarus's economic growth, which in the 2000s outpaced Russia's. One reason was that besides the Russian market, Belarus gained access to the European market. In 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland joined the European Union. If we look at the Belarusian exports in 2005, Russia accounted for only 35%, while the European Union accounted for 45%. How did that happen? That's because with Vladimir Putin's rise to power, the most crucial source of income for Belarus in the 90s, oil transit and refining, was cut off by Russia. Previously, the scheme worked as follows. Belarus received oil from Russia without paying export duties, then sold oil products at global prices in Russia and third countries. The non-marketability of this pricing scheme was quite obvious. The new Russian leadership had a reasonable question. Why was Belarus, instead of Russia itself, profiting from Russian oil? Moreover, one of the key goals of the Russian government in the early 2000s was to increase state budget revenues from oil and gas. Anyone benefiting from these rents came under scrutiny. In 2006, Russia unilaterally imposed a duty on oil supplies to Belarus, formally violating the customs union agreement between the two countries. Russia did this after it was revealed that since 1997, Belarus had not been paying Russia for the re-export of its oil to third countries. In other words, Belarus could buy oil cheaply for its own needs, but if it needed to sell it further, it had to pay a duty. However, these duties were not being paid, meaning the agreement was violated. As a result, Russia imposed duties on all oil exports to Belarus, but then Russian company Transneft suddenly discovered that after these duties were introduced, Belarus started siphoning transit oil from the Druzhba pipeline, which transports crude oil to Europe. This conflict ended like the previous one. The presidents of the two countries had a conversation on the phone, and Belarus's conditions were eased. In general, Belarus skillfully leveraged its position as an indispensable intermediary in the transportation of oil and gas. Beyond all that, disputes between the countries also arose over potash. Widely used as a fertilizer, potash is extracted in Belarus by Belaruskali, a company of immense national significance, akin to Russia's Gazprom and Rosneft combined. Some Belarusian media even call it a national treasure. Belarus struck a deal with Russian Uralkali, forming a cartel that controlled about a third of the global potash fertilizer market. They agreed on joint sales and artificially limited supply to maintain high prices, essentially an OPEC for fertilizers. However, in 2012, Uralkali began bypassing the cartel in its sales, leading to a drop in Belaruskali's revenue. Belarus accused Uralkali of breaching the cartel agreement, and KGB agents arrested the CEO of Uralkali at a Minsk airport. After several months in a Minsk prison, he was released back to Russia, and Belarus withdrew from the cartel, turning into a competitor to Russia in the potash fertilizer market. These constant fluctuations in relations with Russia encouraged Belarus to diversify. Thus, like Ukraine, in 2009, Belarus joined the EU's Eastern Partnership Program alongside Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Essentially, it was a demo version of the European Union, showcasing the benefits of tariff-free trade and open borders. For Ukraine, joining was seen as a political move toward European integration, but Belarus viewed it as a business project, as the program provided access to Western loans and grants. And now, Belarusian programmers easily found clients for their projects from EU countries, which later became one of the factors in the success of Belarus's IT sector, but more on that later. However, just like in the case of the Union State with Russia, the Eastern Partnership bore the signature style of the Belarusian leadership, which fought for its interests while accusing the other side of insufficient readiness for deeper integration. For example, in 2014, Belarus, aiming to become the main trade intermediary between the European Union and Russia, proposed including Russia in the Eastern Partnership program. Naturally, the EU rejected this idea, as no one needed such a competitor. Shortly after that, the EU probably realized that Belarus was of little use in the Eastern Partnership and had no intention of becoming part of the European Union in the future, unlike Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia. As a result, its participation in the program started to be restricted. But Belarus did not desperately bargain and try to profit from everything for no reason. The fact is that since the early 2000s, Belarus's external debt had been growing at a very rapid pace. And what was most dangerous, it grew faster than the Belarusian economy. You may ask why, if from the previous description it seemed like everything was fine with the economy. It was even growing faster than Russia's. The reason is that Belarus has a very high level of dollarization in its economy. A high level of dollarization means that people simply do not trust the national currency. Major purchases, such as apartments or cars, are made in dollars. When hiring, salaries are also calculated in dollars, and so on. To understand how dire the situation is, it's enough to say that inflation in Belarus often does not fall below 10%. And from 2009 to 2015, the Belarusian government carried out as many as 8 devaluations of its currency. Both of these factors simply eat up people's savings if they keep them in a national currency. And if your own citizens do not trust the national currency, why would foreign investors? That's why Belarus's external debt is denominated mainly not in Belarusian rubles, but in the currencies of other states. And the general rule of debt is that it must be repaid, and to repay foreign currency debt, one must first earn that currency. Therefore, every extra dollar, euro, and even Russian ruble was important for Belarus, as it reduced the burden of the country's debt. And given that a significant part of the country's enterprises were state-owned, it didn't matter whether the foreign currency was earned by the state or businesses. In fact, earning foreign currency became the #1 goal for years to come. And for this, Belarus, led by Lukashenko, found the most sophisticated ways. By the late 2000s, the authorities of Belarus had proven themselves to be excellent negotiators, managing to extract the maximum benefits from both sides: resources from Russia in the east and foreign currency loans from Europe in the west. While agreements with Russia were more or less settled, foreign debts still needed to be repaid. As a result, Belarus in the 21st century became a machine for earning foreign currency by almost any means. Even Lukashenko repeatedly stated that businesses must generate foreign revenue. To achieve this, the government and businesses focused on what they had always done well: exporting high-value added products. While in Soviet times this mainly involved technology, in the 21st century Belarus turned to the service sector, particularly IT. In 2005, a special economic regime called the High-Tech Park was established in the country. In languages spoken in Belarus, the word park typically refers to a specific location, but in this case, the entire country essentially became one big park. This meant that any IT company in Belarus that became a resident of the park was exempt from profit tax and VAT and could work with foreign partners without restrictions. A business that can legally avoid paying taxes is bound to grow. As a result, Belarus became a hub for thousands of IT projects, including the Viber Messenger, which was later banned in Russia by Roskomnadzor, and the game World of Tanks. Thousands of other products went unnoticed because Belarusian developers were simply writing code under contract or selling it to large companies. For example, this was the fate of the acquired by Facebook MSQRD app, one of the first to allow real-time face alterations during video calls. To understand the significance of the IT industry for the Belarusian economy, consider this. In 2021, IT services accounted for about 30% of service exports, comparable to oil exports in the 1990s. However, Belarus did not rely solely on tax incentives and benefits to generate foreign currency. It was one of the first countries in the world to officially recognize cryptocurrency as an important part of the economy and created highly attractive conditions for the crypto industry. It abolished income tax on mining and made cryptocurrency a legal means of payment. However, these permissions apply only to residents of the high-tech park, that is, companies registered in Belarus. Given that in neighboring Russia, cryptocurrency is not recognized as a legal means of payment, Belarus became a regional magnet for crypto money and, consequently, foreign currency. Now, taking into account the challenges Belarus faced as a newly independent state, initially unable to even feed itself, would you consider the last 30 years successful for the country and its people? During this time, Belarus has transformed into a country with above-average global income levels. Today, its GDP per capita is on par with resource-rich neighboring countries like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. At the same time, income inequality in Belarus remains relatively low, comparable to Finland. This is why sources from the west of Belarus often classify it as a market socialist state. But if we look at Belarus, it turns out that it is not just a market socialist state. In fact, it is a cooperative with almost 10 million participants, whose CEO for more than 30 years has been Alexander Grigorievich Lukashenko, who makes everyone work. I'm not joking. Until 2018, Belarus had a tax on the unemployed, which forced people to pay the state if they were not officially employed anywhere. Later, this unpopular measure was abolished, and instead, higher rates were introduced for utility payments. This example explains why Belarus is a pure corporation with a clear efficiency metric. Every member must earn money, preferably in foreign currency. This applies to both businesses and officials. If, after an official takes office, the inflow of foreign currency in their controlled sector increases, then they are doing well. If not, they're penalized.
Вы из меня идиота хотите сделать, что я с поля должен ехать, просить газ, нефть и прочие там кредиты, а потом бежать в магазин цены контролировать? Так нахрена вы мне нужны тогда?
However, any successful corporation actively adapts to new market realities, implements modern technologies, and is managed by a board of directors. But in Belarus, there is only one director. Even the most successful company can face a management crisis. In 2020, mass protests erupted in Belarus against the election results, in which Alexander Lukashenko once again claimed victory. Why were these protests so significant? They were far from the first. Protests are a normal part of any country's political life. But in 2020, not just tens, but hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Minsk. And a distinguishing feature was not only the number of protesters, but also that, for the first time, Lukashenko turned to Russia for help in suppressing the unrest. What has changed in Belarus since then? The real problem is that nothing has changed so far. In 1994, Alexander Lukashenko ran for office as a man who set out to fight corruption and the old elites. One of his campaign posters featured the quote, "The era of 70-year-old rulers is coming to an end. Belarus needs new people and a new policy." But today, Alexander Lukashenko himself has turned 70. This is why Belarus is facing an urgent question. Which younger and more ambitious candidate will replace the country's leader, just as Lukashenko was back in 1994?
Я им сказал, что самый лучший следственный изолятор и наручники. Я гарант Конституции. У меня не все боятся, но боятся.
It seems that Alexander Grigorievich understands this well. He himself regularly says that he is not eternal and that one day the republic will have a new leader.
А надо сделать так, чтобы система работала не завязанная на личности, в том числе и Лукашенко, потому что он не вечен, придут другие.
However, in the presidential elections held at the end of January 2025, he registered once again and, of course, won. Whether he was being insincere after his victory when he said that he didn't want to run, we are unlikely to ever know.
Я не хотел идти на эти выборы.
But if it's true, then it means that today there is no one in the Belarusian leadership whom Lukashenko, an experienced politician and diplomat, sees as capable of leading the country in his place. To some extent, this is a global trend. Many countries today are led by very elderly politicians. But part of the blame also lies with Alexander Grigorievich himself, who has controlled the country's political life for more than 30 years. And the problem is that more than anyone else, Lukashenko has demonstrated his ability to skillfully maneuver between the West and the East during his years in power. He knows how to put on a brave face in a bad situation and push his agenda even from a weak position. Finding someone with the same skills and experience within Belarus's current political system seems almost impossible. What will happen to Lukashenko's corporation after he leaves remains anyone's guess. Perhaps the corporation called Belarus will face a leadership crisis, and as is often the case in big business, a major buyer will emerge at such a moment. Or perhaps new blood will breathe life into Belarus and turn it into the truly progressive center of Europe that ordinary Belarusians dream of. All that remains is to hope that a worthy successor to Lukashenko will be found. After all, we all know that stepping down as president can be done easily and quickly if one truly wants to.
Я ухожу. Я сделал все, что мог.
And according to Lukashenko himself, today he does want to step down.
Я уже наработался. Я уже наелся этой президентской доли. Я лучшие годы своей жизни отдал строительству этой страны.